400 millimeters might not be enough for small birds and distant wildlife on a full-frame camera, but if you're looking for a telephoto zoom for birds, wildlife, and general nature photography, and you own an APS-C mirrorless camera from Sony or Nikon, or are willing to use the crop mode on your full-frame camera, or crop to 600 millimeter equivalent in post, then I can highly recommend the Tamron 50-400 f4.5 to 6.3 Di3 VC VXD zoom. I have the Sony version on my A6700. It's not a perfect lens. No one makes a perfect lens. But in most all situations it is sharp and crisp at all focal lengths, even at its widest aperture, and has the reach needed for even small birds and almost all wildlife, works well as a macro lens, 1:2 ratio for half macro, and has a wide enough wide end to be useful for landscapes as well. Focus, at least on my Sony, is fast and accurate and works well with AI subject recognition and eye-tracking autofocus. While it's a bit heavier than I might like, being a full-frame lens, it is manageable all day in the field, especially if you use a cotton carrier or the like to keep the weight off your hands and arms while moving around. Over the summer I took thousands of photos of birds and quite a few macros, but I did not have enough experience with this lens and larger wildlife until returning from 11 days in Yellowstone in late September and early October. While there I had lots of wildlife opportunities, but I was also surprised by how much I used the wide end of the zoom for landscape photos. For birds then, let's take a few examples. ISO 100 at f6.3 at 1/640th, program mode with my bird and wildlife modifications. The mother piping plover was about 30 feet away on the beach. Even with birds as well camouflaged as this, the Tamron is able to engage the camera's autofocus and focus quickly and accurately. As you can see from the processed crop, there's lots of detail to work with, even with the birds as small in the frame as they were. I generally shoot wide open with the Tamron, and the results are excellent in any light. We also had nesting least terns on the beach this summer. Again, ISO 100 at f6.3 at 1/640th. While the f6.3 maximum aperture might be a limitation in low light, in good light it yields excellent depth of field for birds and wildlife subjects. Again, plenty of detail and contrast for the crop needed to fill the frame. Since there were birds in the air almost all the time, I came to appreciate the Tamron's fast focus and its resolving power. You need both for birds in flight, as your framing is never as tight as you might like, even at 600 millimeter equivalent. This is ISO 800 at f6.3 at 1/2000th, with program mode and my birds in flight and action modifications. And this one is ISO 400 at 1/2000th. Focus on the Tamron is certainly up to the most challenging flight shots. Of course, the closer you can get to the bird, the more detail the Tamron will give you. These shots, in the shade, were at ISO 1250 and from about 20 feet, and still capture good color and detail at 600 millimeter equivalent. Here in full sun from about 10 feet, so essentially full frame, there is nothing that tests the resolution limits of a lens like a cedar waxwing. And at about 8 feet, this Carolina wren, visiting our back deck under the feeders, shows what the Tamron is capable of. As distances increase, as here with this great egret in the marsh at about 15 yards, you expect to lose some detail, but the Tamron holds detail well. I was using highlight protection metering here to hold the highlight detail. Or take this great blue heron at about 25 yards, enough detail for a significant crop to fill the frame. And of course, the Tamron handles insects well too. This is at 600 millimeter equivalent and closest focus distance at about 4.5 feet. This eastern amberwing dragonfly is not much bigger than a bumblebee. The hummingbird sphinx moth was caught in flight in a garden in Santa Fe, New Mexico. At the macro end of things, the Tamron focuses to 1:2, or 0.5x, at its 50 to 75 millimeter end, and working close provides an authentic macro feel. All these shots were between 75 and 105 millimeters, and from under a foot. This is as good a spot as any to talk about the Tamron's one weakness. In about one shot in 500, you can see some chromatic aberration, mostly blue-purple along the edges of subjects. The conditions have to be just right, or maybe I should say just wrong. It mostly happens in strongly backlighted situations, with the subject slightly underexposed due to the bright background. It is more likely to show up in close-ups where the depth of field leaves the edge of the subject slightly out of focus when the camera is focused on the eye. Here's an example. You have to enlarge the image pretty far to see the chromatic aberration, but it is there, as the screenshot from Photometer shows. It's fairly easy to remove with a color range mask and decreased saturation. And again, when the light is right, which is almost all the time, it's not an issue. In all my shots of larger wildlife in Yellowstone, I did not have a single shot that showed chromatic aberration. And of course, that brings us to wildlife. The Tamron 600mm equivalent on an APS-C camera is often enough to fill the frame without cropping when visiting areas, be it the mountain valleys of Yellowstone or the plains of East or South Africa, where wildlife is abundant and can be encountered at a relatively close distance, anything from 25 yards to about 50 yards. Even when shooting wildlife at greater distances, 150 to 300 yards, the Tamron and most APS-C sensors have enough resolution to crop the subject to fill the frame. This bull and cow moose at Floating Island Lake in Yellowstone were between 150 and 200 yards from the pull-off beside the park road. And this is a full-frame, uncropped shot of a bison at about 25 yards, as close as you are supposed to get, but he surprised us by walking up the ridge behind us when we were not looking. In a similar, unintentional encounter, this female gray wolf walked up on me when I was sitting above a carcass, above the road and up a ridge. She came up the far side of the ridge, and when I got to my feet, she was only about 25 feet from me, way too close. She decided I was no threat, and evidently not as tasty as the carcass below me, so she circled me at about 30 feet. The headshot is essentially uncropped at 600 millimeters, and the second shot is uncropped at only 361 millimeter equivalent as she passed by. This shot of her mate, a sleek black wolf, was taken a few hours earlier as he left the carcass, and from across the road at about 60 yards. Speaking of heavy crops, this is a grizzly bear and wolves at close to a half mile, cropped to 2 megapixels out of the 26. It amazes me that the Tamron is able to resolve any detail at this distance. And for those of you wondering if the f6.3 is going to be too much of a limitation, this is a shot of a coyote on a carcass across the Yellowstone River in the Hayden Valley, and it was taken well before the sun was over the ridge behind, at ISO 20,000, cropped and denoised in Photometer. Not the greatest shot, but satisfying considering the conditions. Finally, as I mentioned already, I found that in the vast landscapes of Yellowstone, the 75mm end of the Tamron allowed me to select landscape details that a shorter lens, or a longer one for that matter, could not have captured. All in all, the Tamron 50-400 f4.5 to 6.3 Di3 VC VXD zoom is one of the finest lenses I've ever owned, and on an APS-C camera gives an unmatched range and flexibility for birds, wildlife, macro, and landscapes without sacrificing quality. It's heavier than I would like and a bit bulky, but nothing compared to some of the full-frame alternatives in super zooms for nature photography. Highly recommended.